Let's make a book. So for this, we're going to use some cardstock. The cardstock doesn't have to be anything specific. It could have stuff printed on it or be blank. We don't really care too much unless we're trying to order it. As I'm folding it, all I'm thinking about is trying to flatten the paper. I'm not necessarily trying to make a very crisp edge just yet. And to do that, I'm going to use a Sharpie. Now, a Sharpie is a good stand-in for a bone folder. If you don't want to use a classic bone folder, you could use a plastic bone folder, but the Sharpie will do just fine. I'm making sure that the edges are actually aligned properly before I do this. If I don't align them properly, it's okay. I can always go back and cut up the paper later. It's mostly out of convenience that I'm putting so much effort into making sure that these snugly fit together. If the pieces of paper are not fitting together properly, once I go to actually put holes into them and put the string through them and the needle, it's going to start to fall apart. So in this case, I'm mostly just making sure that instead of a sharp edge, I'm getting as flat and as snugly fitting as possible. Once I have that sorted, I'm going to do that for a bunch more of these pieces of paper, and I will have many of what we will call a signature. In addition to the signatures, obviously we need a cover. Now, the cover isn't an exact science. All you need to know is that reading from left to right, you want it to be a little bit longer than the actual paper you're working with. Now we're going to put some station holes where they belong. In this case, instead of using a scale or a ruler to pace all of this out, I have this little guide that I'm using. Now you can use the same sort of guide, or you can just position the holes however you want. You just want to make sure that between the signatures, all of the holes are fairly consistent. If they're really inconsistent, it'll be obvious as you're trying to stitch it together that nothing is matching up correctly. But there's a little bit of play, and it being exactly correct each time is not so important. It's also entirely up to preference how far out from the edge you want to make the holes on the cover. Now that we have everything poked, we have our stations in each of our signatures, and we have some holes on the cover, I'm going to start by just taking the first signature and the cover, focusing on getting these two bound to one another. I'm going to take my needle and run it first through one of the station holes at the top of the inside of my first signature. And as I pull it through, I don't actually want it to go all the way through. I want to leave myself some play at the end. I'm going to set that aside, and I'm going to pick up the cover. I'm going to put the needle through the front of the cover. All I want to make sure is that it's not on the same side as where the signature is, so that I can have this loop over top of it. When I come out the other side, I want to make sure that it's on the left side of the loop and not on the outside. Because what I'm about to do is I'm going to lap over that loop and then back through from right to left. I'm going to pull it all the way through, and then I'm going to go back through the station hole that I came out through originally. Now in this case, I want to make sure that I'm not poking through the actual string that's already there. If I do, I'm going to have to make sure I come back out so that I don't get it tangled. I want to be able to pull really tightly and to get a nice knot at the end of this. Now the knot that we're about to tie is very similar to the beginning of tying your shoe. But in this case, I'm going to do it twice, and I'm going to make sure that I go in opposite directions each time I do it. So if I were to put right over left and pull, on the second one I'll put left over right and pull, or vice versa. Now, as will be the case every time that we're on the middle of a signature, really the only thing we can do is just come right back out the signature through the next station hole. This next part is going to look very similar to how we started. I'm going to come over the front of the book, and I'm going to poke through the cover from the outside. I'm going to pull the string all the way through and send it to the left side of the station. We'll get to another familiar spot as we see that the left side has this free string. I'm going to come back through the loop from right to left, and once again, I'm going to go through the station hole. This time, however, I'm not going to be tying a knot. All I'm going to do is just go right over to the next station hole and do the exact same thing on the next one. We're going to repeat that process just over and over again for however many stations you've poked until you get to the last one. Now, the last one's not that different. Just like before, we're going to poke in through the front of the cover, we're going to lead back around and go through that hole that we created earlier. Pull it taut. And in this case, instead of going back into that same signature, we're going to add a new signature and go into its first station. Once we're through that first station, there's nothing crazy that we're going to do. We're just going to go right to the second one, loop it around to get ready for the next type of stitch. As I'm doing that, I want to make sure that everything is nice and snug, so I'm going to pull parallel to the spine of the book. And then, in between the two stitches that I've previously done, and also in between the cover and the first signature, I'm going to send that needle around the stitch that I completed earlier, pull it taut, and then send the needle back through the second signature. Once that's snug, I'm ready to go through the next station and repeat the process. At the last station on this signature, what I'm going to do is mostly the same process, right up until a point that I'm looping around and ready to go to the next signature. The stitch that's actually going to allow me to do that is called a kettle stitch, and we're going to do it on the edge of every one of the signatures. The way it works is I'm just going to leave myself a loop that I can send a needle back through before I add the next signature. As I'm adding this next signature, I will note that there are two different ways that you can think about doing this next part. The actual stitch isn't different from what we were doing before, it's just going to feel a little bit different because we're now working with the signatures instead of the cover. So the first way to do it is the one that's easiest if you're working with a curved needle. So in this case, I'm going to be going through the first station hole into the inside of the book, back out the second station hole, and I'm going to stitch around the previous stitch that I had done that is binding the first and the second signature. I'm going to pull that string completely taut and make sure that all of the string has followed me through, and then I'm going to go back through that second station hole so I can move on to the next one. As I pull this taut, just a reminder, this next stitch is not different, it's the exact same thing. I'm just going to do it a slightly different way because if you're working with a straight needle, this may come in handy. So I'm going to come out that station hole the exact same way that I did before, and I'm going to accomplish the same thing, except this time instead of using the curved needle to go around the stitch, I'll send the needle into the location where I want the stitch to be between the other two signatures, go find it, place it back onto the other side of the stitch, pull it through, and end up in a familiar spot. Just as before, I'll go back through the same station hole that I came out originally and move on to the next one. Each time I reach the end of a signature and I'm ready to move on to the next one, I'm going to do that same kettle stitch that I talked about earlier. I'm going to make sure I leave myself a little bit of a loop to send the needle back through before adding that other signature. This is where I'll get into a little bit of a rhythm and just start to enjoy the meditative aspect of doing the stitches. Just by following the same steps, I'll eventually reach the spot where I have one more signature and the other cover to be bound. And just for simplicity, and to keep with what I've been doing already, I'm going to flip around the book so that I have the signature to be bound nearest me. For a moment, I'm going to ignore the signature and just go through the outside of the cover, being sure that when I come back out, I'm on the left side of the loop that I created. And here you just see me fixing that, but you want it to look like this. Still ignoring that last signature, I want to loop around the stitch that had bound the previous two signatures, pull it taut, go back out over the loop that I just created, and go through that station. Once I come back out through that second station, I'm going to start off pretty similar, except this time I'm going to go left to right around that previously made stitch. I'll go through the front of the cover, being sure that when I come back out, I'm on the left side of that stitch, so that I can loop over it around the stitch that's holding the last two signatures, going over what I just did, and back through the signature, making a complete loop. Even on the last station, the stitch is going to be the exact same. The only difference at the very end of this will be that I'll tie it off on the inside of the signature. Before I do the final tie-off, I'm going to make sure that everything is nice and taut. I'm going to rotate the book so that I can keep track of how I'm tying this knot. Just like I did earlier with the shoe tie, I'm going to start tying a shoe by going around the loop that I created inside of this signature. And when I go and do it again, I'm going to go the opposite way. So here I went from the right first. Now this time, I'm going to go from the left. If you're at all interested in having a page keeper, you could keep this string long and cut it right at the needle, or you could do it like I'm doing here and cut it short so that it stays inside the book. I'll go back to the front of the book, make sure that that knot is still how I wanted it to be, make any adjustments if necessary, and cut it off as well. So there we have it. That's the book. What we did here was called a Coptic bind, and it's most useful for things like sketching or for custom books because it's able to take on any paper and you can also lay it flat. As I'm flipping through this, I want to point out that there were a couple skills that I didn't address as I was going over how to bind the book, so we might as well go over those now. We want to be able to thread a needle in a way that we can get the thread through all of the station holes without ripping them or making them larger. So the perfect way to do that is simply to take the needle, and after you thread it, send the needle through the center of the thread. Pulling it around the needle makes it so that the thread left over at the end is about the same width as the needle itself. For this book, we used about 7 feet of thread, but if you were to need more, you would want a good knot. And the perfect knot in this case would be the weaver's knot. Step 1 is just to make a loop, grab some of the extra string coming from the spool, and send another loop through the first loop until you create this pattern. One of these ends will be loose and the other one will be on the rest of your string. In any case, you're going to take the string coming off of the book and send it through this end loop. You can actually set that string down as you're doing the rest of this because you're going to tighten only the new string until the string that's on the book doubles back on itself. Once it's doubled back on itself, you can pull everything nice and tight until you either hear a click or it can't be moved anymore. And on that note, happy binding.